Hello and welcome to today's exciting class brought to you by Uchee Pines Institute as part of the Lifestyle Educator Extension Program. Today we'll be looking at something very important that each one of us has to truly understand, and not in terms of only physiology but also in terms of practical choices and practical decisions that we need to make based on this system. We're going to be looking at, of course, the digestive system and related disorders. Before we look at the physiology and also lifestyle-related disability involving this system, I want to give you a scenario. Let's say you wake up early one morning and you realize that someone has made a wonderful breakfast for you. You go out and you take a seat at the breakfast table, and there in front of you is this wonderful looking meal. Nice Belgian waffle, this warm and toasty smell just rising up and greeting your nostrils. And then you go to the stove top and you add a scoop of this wonderful looking strawberry topping. Can you almost smell this delicious meal? Are you salivating at all at this point? I think that you would agree with me on this point. Digestion really begins in the mind. And it's really a dramatic part of the whole digestive system, and that is to actually look at your food and see that it looks good and realize that it must taste good based on the smells and the sights and all of the sensory appeal that the food brings to you. But I'll give you a warning as well. Don't look just on the sensory appeal, because we're told the king's delicacies, which probably were the most appealing to the sensory organs at that time, in the book of Proverbs, the king's delicacies can be deceptive foods. And so keep this in mind. We can't just look upon our diet with sensory appeal. We must be looking upon our diet with a mind that adheres to biblical principle in terms of diet. And so before we look into physiology, let's look at some of this biblical principle that should govern and guide not only our diet, but also should help in the prevention of the derangement of the digestive organs. I want to take you to a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2003. It said in this study, the first published report of a clinical trial has biblical origins. In the book of Daniel, reference is made to the unwillingness of the Israelite Daniel to accept the diet offered by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Now we have another citation here from another medical journal. It reads, around 600 BC, Daniel of Judah conducted what is widely regarded as the first or earliest recorded clinical trial. His trial compared the health effects of a plant-based diet with those of a royal Babylonian diet over a 10-day period. So these two are modern-day descriptions of this first recorded clinical trial. And it's amazing that this clinical trial had to do with a very important factor in lifestyle, and that is diet. Diet is extremely important, not only to the proper health of the digestive system, but it impacts the whole system, the whole body. Now, let's take a look at actually this research study in its entirety. We'll turn to Daniel 1. It reads, and the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now, what was the clinical background to this study? Well, we know that Daniel and his friends were taken captive from their native land of Israel and taken over to Babylon. They were treated as slaves, but all of a sudden they were brought into the royal household, the royal court, and treated like kings. And so here was this opportunity they had to eat like a king, to dress like a king, to be like a king, and to be trained like a Babylonian king. I'll submit that to you as well. But Daniel and his friends realized something, and that was that they were there to be trained as Babylonians. Yet they held to their identity as children of God. We know that their names that were given were representative of the Babylonian gods and of their servitude to Babylon. but they kept their Israelite names, not just in for namesake, but also in principle. For it reads that Daniel purposed in his heart, or Daniel resolved in his heart, that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. He realized that there were foods there that were put on the table in the Babylonian court that were not the best for his health and well-being, and most importantly for his spiritual discernment. And so he purposed in his heart, he made a decision not to defile himself with this kind of diet. Now, this study was really based on a resolution. And when God gives us a purpose, and he puts a purpose into our hearts, and truly he gives us the strength to follow in a purposeful life, he also gives us the plan in which to accomplish this. He won't leave us destitute and comfortless. And he gave Daniel a plan. And this truly was the ideal clinical study, the first clinical study ever conducted or at least published by mankind. And this was Daniel's plan. Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. This study was basically looking at a 10-day period in which Daniel and his friends were given a plant-based diet, and the results were really astounding. At the end of just 10 days, we saw a remarkable improvement or a remarkable stability to Daniel and his friends' health. They were fairer and fatter in flesh, and that does not mean they became obese or overweight. It means that they were ruddy in appearance, they were strong and vigorous, and especially when they were compared to those who were on the royal Babylonian diet. And it says also, after 3 years of this dietary plan, that in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. This was no yo-yo diet. This was no fad diet. This was the diet, the optimal diet. This is God's diet, God's plan. And Daniel and his friends were blessed by following out God's principles in dietetics. What could have triggered this response in Daniel's mind? What could have prompted him to actually yearn after this kind of diet? Well, really, when it comes down to it, he was yearning after God and yearning after truth and righteousness and right doing. And so this was really the foundation for his right decisions. He also was acquainted with the Scriptures. And as I mentioned before, in Proverbs 23:3, it says, actually let's back up to verse 1. It says, "When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food." Another thing that he could have read, "Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Daniel and his friends truly were eating for strength, and their mind and their bodies were rewarded richly by the Lord. This was the dietary intake plan that God had instilled from the very beginning. And we see that people living before the flood were living for a millennium at a time, over 1,000, well, almost 1,000 years in some cases. But after the flood, mankind was changed in dietetic practices. But we know that the Lord gave us originally dietary intake, and that was this, found in Genesis 1:29. "And God said, See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food." And in Genesis 3:18, God also specifically instructed the eating of vegetables. He said, "Ye shall eat of the herb of the field," in Genesis 3:18. So the combination of fruits, nuts, grains, vegetables, and legumes provided the perfect diet, the ideal diet. This is also known as the Genesis diet. Many people are referring to that today as the Genesis diet. but is also known as pulse, which is mentioned as the diet that was requested by Daniel and his friends back there in this ancient clinical study. After the flood, of course, there was not a huge amount of vegetation available. Everything was basically being renewed. It was all destroyed, and then the animals were there. And so God has instructed that 7 of every clean animal be brought on board as kind of a emergency ration for mankind. Now, there were only 2 of every unclean animal, and so we know that Noah did not eat the unclean animals, because if he had, they would have become extinct. They would not have had a mate. But God had commanded every clean animal could be eaten. But what happened as a result of this change in diet? We see a dramatic decrease in longevity, even among those who were of the righteous line of Noah, coming down through Shem and all the way to Abraham. Abraham only lived to be 175, and he was truly a man that lived by faith, that lived by a biblical, godly principle. But these change in dietetics had a change in his stature and in his longevity. Now, in the beginning, when it all comes down to it, we ate our fruits and vegetables. This may be something your mom tried to instill in you, or maybe your grandmother, maybe an aunt. But have we really followed that counsel? I'll submit to you that Daniel and his friends realized this was the optimal diet. They didn't make excuses about it. They took that admonition and they followed it. And just like today, they were in an environment where every inducement was present. Every opportunity to descend in morality was present there in the Babylonian court. It's everywhere here. We don't have to be members of royalty to be degraded in morals. But what about our clinical background? During the time of Daniel, he was captive in a hostile enemy court. Are we held captive today? I'll submit to you that there are no monarchs that are on the throne that are saying off with their heads in a moment's notice. But we do have a hostile enemy who is on the prowl, who is seeking to destroy us and to debase us, not only spiritually speaking, but also physically. And so, shouldn't we also be looking to our diet and asking the question, is this God's plan for what I should be putting into my mouth? For just as we are surrounded with all of these inducements to lowered morality, we're also surrounded with the availability to eat like kings and queens, to drink the wine of Babylon, so to speak. We have, in terms of the royal diet today, a far more rich and luxurious diet than even Daniel had in those times, in terms of variety, taste, and texture. We're almost like children in candy stores, walking around, and any little impulse we can be satisfied with. We can get it to go. We can get it hot. We can get it cold. We can get it however we want it these days, however our taste buds declare. But unfortunately, we're taking part in a diet that is debilitating to us. This diet has been called often the sad diet, the standard American diet. But I'll submit to you that God's diet is the glad diet, God's longevity advancing diet. The sad diet is characteristic of these principles: high simple carbohydrate, high fat, high animal protein, low fiber, and low nutrient density. You see, the sad diet is a highly refined diet, which takes out many of the nutrients that are normally found in plant-based foods. But the glad diet is actually the exact opposite of man's sad diet. It actually is consisting of high complex carbohydrates, low in fat, no animal protein in this diet, the Genesis diet, high in fiber naturally, and very high in nutrient density, high in antioxidants, and all of these rich phytochemicals, the plant chemicals that are so promoting to our health and longevity. as important as it is to know the principles and the different characteristics of these diets, it's also important for us to know the exact physiology of the digestive system so that we can see how these different diets impact the digestive system itself and in turn impact the whole body. So we're going to take a look section by section at the digestive system, beginning with the mouth. Of course, when you begin to have your meal, you put a morsel of food in through your lips and you begin a process known as chewing. The formal term for this is mastication. And basically you chew up the food into smaller particles, and if you are chewing enough, you should be chewing until your food becomes almost like a liquid, semi-liquidy consistency. Proper chewing is essential to good digestion because it also mixes the food products with an enzyme, actually two enzymes, most notably the amylase found in the saliva, which is actually something that breaks down carbohydrates. Also, some fats are hydrolyzed, the beginning of the process of the breakdown of fats, right there in the mouth. Of course, when the food is, the swallow is initiated, basically it's out of our hands after that point. We can determine how much we want to chew our food, but when we start the swallow process, the reflexes actually take over and our food is basically taken from us and put into the processing plants of the digestive system. The stomach initially is where the food goes down into. Now let's take a look back at this other slide. We see that when food is swallowed, we have two possible routes the food could go. If the food were to go into the larynx, we would not be able to breathe. We would choke, and this is actually how people choke on their food. But we have a little flap on the back of the pharynx structure that is called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is actually kind of a trap door that closes over the larynx when the swallow reflex is triggered. And so the food goes down into the esophagus. The esophagus goes down into the stomach. Once swallowed, food is referred to as chyme. This chyme makes its way down the esophagus into the stomach, where the stomach acid deactivates the salivary amylase, and the enzyme pepsin is activated to begin the stomach's chemical digestive process. From the stomach, the food is sent over to the small intestine, and the small intestine, amazingly, is the area where most of the digestion or the absorption of nutrients occurs. Now, the small intestine is also kind of the sampling place for the food that is being digested and broken down into smaller particles by the stomach. The stomach is not only a chemical treating plant, but also, looking back here, also is a churning facility. It churns and furthermore breaks down foods. Particularly this long area here we see at the bottom, this is known as the pylorus of the stomach, and we actually have a little valve here at the bottom of the stomach that's known as the pyloric sphincter. Now, when the food is somewhat digested, a little bit of the food will be sent through the pyloric sphincter over into the small intestine. And in the small intestine, it's tested to see if it's adequately prepared for entry into the small intestine. If it's not, if it's full of undigested fats, it's sent, a message is sent that a little bit more churning, a little bit more time in the stomach is needed. And so logically, the most digestible foods are the simplest foods, like fruits and carbohydrates are very simple to digest. Fats and proteins take a little bit longer. Fats, of course, are the most difficult to digest. Of course, the small intestine plays a major role in digestive process, not only in absorption, but also in the further breakdown of the chyme or the food that has been swallowed. When the food is sent through the pyloric sphincter over to the small intestine, we actually have further secretions that are sent out. We have bile that's secreted from the gallbladder to aid in the digestion of fats, and also the pancreas adds enzymes to further break down the food. The small intestine then absorbs most of the nutrients from food as the contents are passed down into the large intestine by a series of convulsing movements. Now, this is known as peristalsis. Peristalsis is kind of like a wave-like motion that actually kind of a milking motion that pushes the food along the intestine. Taking a look here at the various parts of the small intestine, we can realize that each of these portions probably plays a little bit different role because they're in a little bit different location in terms of their anatomy. We'll start with the duodenum. The duodenum is largely responsible for the breakdown of food in the small intestine. We actually have an increased amount of enzymes that are active in this portion of the small intestine because we have secretions from the gallbladder, such as bile, and also from the pancreas that help to break down different particles of food, such as fats for bile, and digestive enzymes such as lipase and amylase and trypsin. These are all digestive enzymes that are released in the duodenum as needed based on the food contents. Going down further into the small intestine, we have the next portion, which is known as the jejunum. It basically has a lining which is very specialized in the absorption of carbohydrates and protein. Now, it's interesting because this is really where most of the digestive absorption is taking place, in the jejunum. And many of the fats are broken down into smaller particles and actually soaked up into the lining of the intestine. Going further down, we see the ileum here. The ileum mainly just absorbs some leftover products that were not absorbed from the jejunum, such as vitamin B12 and a little bit more of the bile products. And it also has a very distinct function in terms of not just digestion as well, and that is in protecting the small intestine, which is not filled with a lot of bacterial flora. It's protecting this from the bacterial flora that's found in the large intestine in large quantities. And so, as such, the ileum is filled with these places where immune cells are housed. These are known as Peyer's patches. And these are basically lymph nodules that contain large numbers of immune cells and also aid in the digestion of any of the lymphatic vessels are going to aid in the digestion of fats as well. Taking a look here on a closer scale, the pancreas is a very important organ in the digestive process. Pancreas is basically used to secrete a number of digestive enzymes, and we see also an up-close look at the gallbladder, which is a storative organ for bile. Bile is actually produced in the liver, and of course it's used in the breakdown of fats. Now, if we look at this picture, we can see that there are many different areas here, many ducts where these chemicals are released. I'm just going to go through and read off the list here. Number one, we have bile ducts here. Number two, intrahepatic bile duct. And number three, left and right hepatic ducts. Number four, common hepatic duct. Number five, cystic duct. Number six, common bile duct. And 7 is the ampulla of Vater. 8 is the major duodenal papilla. 9 is the gallbladder. 10 through 11, the right and left lobes of the liver. And 12, the spleen. So we have a lot of secretory pathways here whereby digestive enzymes are put into the small intestine. Let's take a look at the very, very small scale digestion that's taking place, and I don't mean small in terms of digestion of nutrients, but in terms of the microscopic functional pathways of the small intestine. If we take a look here at the lining of the small intestine, we see in this slide that the top portion of the lining is known as the villi, and the villi and the microvilli are really where digestion is taking place. You see, food is kind of pulled through, or these nutrient particles are kind of pulled through these villi and brought into the circulation. Now this is interesting because we have larger particles that can be absorbed, such as fats, through not the circulatory system, but actually the lymphatic system. And so proteins and sugars, or I should say amino acids and sugars, or amino acids and carbohydrates, can be pulled through into the circulation readily from the small intestine, but fats are pulled into the lymphatic vessels. Now, we see here that there is a large amount of blood supply here, and I'll take you to this next slide where you see something called the mesentery. The mesentery is basically a area of tissue which kind of houses the circulatory system of the small intestine. And it not only houses, it also kind of protects the small intestine by keeping it orderly and not allowing it to be kind of tied up into knots, so to speak. This is actually kind of a safety tissue as well there in the small intestine. We can take a closer look at this with this diagram here. We see the liver, the large intestine, and the small intestine diagrammed here. And we see the mesentery right there. We can see the mesenteric vein that's coming out of the mesentery and actually goes right over into the liver via the portal vein. And so, as you might be guessing, the liver actually gets many of the products of digestion directly, particularly those that are the proteins and the carbohydrates. And so the liver, of course, as we've learned, plays a huge role in the digestive processing as well, in packaging nutrients and storage. Now, we've seen what happens here to carbohydrates and sugars. Now, what happens to fats then? Well, the fat basically is pulled in through the lymphatic vessels and pulled up into a thoracic duct, which is a large lymphatic vessel, and then let go into the circulation through the left subclavian vein. And it's interesting because these fats are actually put right into the bloodstream. And so they need to be degraded and changed and processed. And so if we have a very high fat diet, we're filling our bloodstream in the space of an hour or two after a meal with a large amount of fat, very unnatural to the human body. And so it's very important for us to ask the question, what about the fat? And to ask for a low-fat diet and to plan and follow out a low-fat diet. In the large intestine, we find that most of the nutrient absorption is already taken place. And so we don't have a lot of digestion taking place here. Mainly, we have just a pathway in which certain nutrients may be reabsorbed, trace nutrients, but mainly digestion is already complete. What we have here is basically a transport mechanism whereby the food is brought out of the body and through the anus, of course, eliminated as feces. Some water is actually brought out of the small intestine, so the large intestine, I should say. So it is important to have a large intestine because the food is further broken down. But it's interesting because the products that constitute feces are mainly fiber, the bulking agents in your food, And more than that, even more so than the fiber, it's actually the lining of the large intestine. You see, the large intestine is kind of like a snake shedding its skin, except it's doing it on the inverted side, the inner side. And every time you eat, the intestinal mucosa or lining of the mucus basically sheds. God has a plan for eating in due season, but many people are told today that they can eat just whenever they want, whatever they want, whenever they want. And I would submit to you that that causes a lot of problems with the large intestine, not only the other organs in digestion, but especially the large intestine, because it's continuously stripping the inner lining of the intestine without giving it proper time to heal. Could this be why studies have shown that when people are eating more than 3 meals per day, or snacking, or those sorts of things, they increase their rate of digestive system cancer, most notably large intestine cancer, by over 200%. It's an amazing finding, given the fact that most people are told to eat very, very frequent small meals today. But what's that doing? That's destroying their large intestine, and it's wearing out their digestive organs. God has a plan much better than man's plan. Now, when we look at this, I told you that mainly the small intestine portion known as the ileum was involved in keeping the rest of the small intestine clean. Now, let's take a look here at that transaction space. We see the ileum and we see the large intestine, the ileum and the cecum. I want you to look down here at the bottom of the slide. Look at this little process that's coming off. This is known as the vermiform process or the appendix. It's amazing because many people will say, well, this little organ doesn't play any role here. But I'll submit to you this organ has a function. It's involved in helping to keep the small intestine clean from the bacterial flora that is thriving in the large intestine that should not be found in large quantities in the small intestine, in the ileum itself. And so it's very important for us to cooperate with this process and eat uncontaminated food, so we're not putting contaminated foods right there into our small intestine. It's kind of a nature's object lesson there. So we should also be watching for food contamination, so that we're not giving the small intestine something that it's not designed to handle. The large intestine can handle a lot more of these pathogens, but the small intestine, it will be debilitated rather quickly. Now, that being said, the pathogens that are found in the large intestine, or I would not say they're truly pathogens, because there are many things that are found in the large intestine that are helpful and beneficial if they stay there in the large intestine. So they're not truly pathogens, they're actually bacterial flora. But if they go elsewhere in the body, they could cause problems. So everything really needs to stay where God designed it to stay. Now, we've seen the digestive system, how things work. But have you ever heard of the phrase dyspepsia? Dyspepsia is basically the derangement of one of these areas of physiology. Now, I will submit to you there are a few key areas that are very notable contributors to dyspepsia. A few of these are improper meal selection and frequency, improper mastication or chewing of the food, improper temperament while we're eating, improper pre- and post-meal activity, enzymatic deficiency, imbalanced flora, and overeating. You see, when it comes down to proper meal selection, of course, we know that God gave us a plan. When He created man, He said that we should eat of the herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and fruits, nuts, grains, vegetables. legumes. All of these things were part of that original diet that God gave us in the very beginning. Now, many of us have decided that we're going to follow our own dietary plan. And if we do this, we very may well be choosing a dietary plan that is against God's will. And so what we need to do is we need to search the scriptures, and we need to realize that the Lord does have a plan for our dietary needs. Next, I said that improper chewing played a role in dyspepsia. But think about this. If we're not chewing our food enough, what is our stomach having to do? It's having to work a lot harder. It's having to do things it was never designed to do. For our stomach does not have teeth. Our stomach has an ability to churn and to mix, and it has a very potent acidic environment to break down food components. But it does not have teeth, so we need to use our teeth the Lord has given us to chew correctly. A study of men that looked at individuals who chewed their food an average of 15 times as compared with those who chewed for an average of 40 times had some startling results. They found that those who were chewing more had less caloric intake, over 11% less. So they ate much less food, and they still felt satisfied. And those who chewed their food more had less hormonal-induced hunger. Their hormones that actually prompt hunger were much less after chewing their food more thoroughly. And they were able to absorb better nutrients better. Why is that? Because they broke down the nutrients as they should have been broken down there in the mouth before they swallowed. Improper temperament. How can this contribute to dyspepsia? It's very simple. When we're anxious or we're angry or we're worried or we're upset, something happens in our stomach that is not very conducive to proper digestion. And that is that our stomach fills up with stomach acid as a protective mechanism, and the whole digestive system shuts down. Blood is diverted from the digestive system over to our muscles so that we can engage in something known as the fight or flight response. And basically, our whole digestive system is put on hold until that problem is dealt with. Now, many people go through their lives with this kind of improper temperament. And so think about the impact that's having upon their digestive system. It's no wonder that many people have ulcers today. Why is that? Because if the stomach is being constantly filled with acid, and that acidic food is just sitting there, think about the impact upon our lining of our stomach. Ulcers, of course, are going to appear. Now, there are also some other issues here. Not only improper temperament is involved in this particular physiology, but also our pre and our post-meal activity, what we decide to do right before we eat or what we decide to do right after we eat. You see, in looking at this model of the circulatory system, we are not seeing one important thing. We see the arteries and the veins in the heart, but what we don't see are the 60,000 miles of capillary vessels that are lining and interspersed within every single vital organ, vital tissue in our body. Now, we have the availability in that 60,000 miles of capillary vessels for 5 liters of blood to be stored at any given time. However, you only have about 5 liters of blood in your body at any given time. And so for the heart to pump effectively, for the whole circulatory system to work, you need to have a certain amount of blood in the arteries and in the veins as well. And so what does that mean? That means that the capillaries cannot be filled totally to full capacity all the time. So what does that mean for you? Well, think about this. There in the mesentery, there are vessels that are coming off of capillaries that are going into the liver, and your food is being packaged there. But let's say you decide that you are going to have some very, very vigorous physical exercise prior to your meal. Do you know where your blood is going to be routed? What capillaries will your blood be routed to? Of course, to your lungs, to your legs, maybe to your arms, your chest, where you've been working those muscles. And so when you eat your food, the blood flow is not going to immediately be able to go to that area because it's going to be repairing broken muscle fragments or the like down in these other tissues that have just been used so vigorously. So it's very important for us to transition into mealtime, ceasing from activity somewhat, doing lighter activity, even mental activity, and then partaking of our meal. Consequently, after the meal as well is very important for us to not go directly into intense mental or physical labor, because the blood will be pulled back to the capillaries either in the brain or pulled to the capillaries in our muscles to provide us with the necessary strength to do that very laborious task. And so it's very important for us to not only have the right mindset, but be doing the right things around mealtime as well. For those people that are having problems with enzymes, many people are turning to enzyme therapy today because they're feeling they're not digesting their food properly. But I'll submit to you, if all of these precepts are followed, your pancreas and your gallbladder should be able to take care of most of the enzymatic deficiencies that you may have. Now, there's some other foods you can also partake of that are rich in digestive enzymes, such as the pineapple. Pineapple is rich in a protein-digesting enzyme known as bromelain. Also, papaya is rich in papain, which also breaks down proteins. And the pancreas, of course, can be benefited by proper attention, so that the digestive enzymes that are coming from the pancreas can be given out in proper measure at proper time. You can flush your bile and your impurities out of the bile by drinking plenty of water, and so that the bile can be clean and pure, and also having plenty of fiber to reabsorb those toxins from the bile. For if we do not have plenty of fiber, those toxins will be pulled back into the lymphatic vessels in the small intestine from the bile, and they'll be put back into the body. And so the best way for us to have a cleaning and proper function of enzymes in the small intestine is for us to drink plenty of water and to eat the right foods. Eat plenty of fruits and vegetables rich in fiber. Another problem that many people face and why they are dyspeptic is that they have an imbalance in intestinal flora. Many people actually are getting ulcers even in their stomach, in their duodenum, because of a bacteria known as H. pylori. Now, it's interesting to note that H. pylori is it's a bacteria that burrows itself into the mucosa of the stomach and the duodenum, and can be a precipitating factor in the formation of these gastric ulcers. But it's been found that plants can help. The individual need not necessarily go and have a course of antibiotics that will totally destroy all of the other beneficial flora in the digestive system. He may just be able to turn to some aloe vera, which, according to a medical journal, the World Journal of Gastroenterology, was found to help heal gastric ulcers. Also, one may turn to broccoli sprouts, which have a remarkable ability to kill H. pylori, to target only H. pylori, and to leave the beneficial bacterial flora alone. Now, raw fruits and vegetables, especially from your own garden, can actually give you a natural source of probiotics, which are natural, good bacteria that are beneficial to digestion. And it's interesting to note that in speaking with a gastroenterologist, he let me know that it's amazing. The field of gastroenterology is changing because people are realizing the benefit of probiotics, of actually helping the digestive system to be in its proper state, in its normal state. Now, I think that many of the benefits of probiotics are happening because many people are also engaging in the antibiotics. They're destroying their flora, so they need to take in more flora. But just taking in raw fruits and vegetables that have not been processed will give you actually the healthy forms of bacteria that will actually help to boost not only your intestinal flora, but it'll even boost vitamin B12, because vitamin B12 comes from these bacteria. Garlic is another great beneficial compound for boosting intestinal flora. It actually helps to kill the bacteria that are harmful while leaving many of those bacteria that are helpful intact, so they can actually function in proper digestion. But I'll submit to you that these things are important, but the very most important factor that is often neglected in the dyspeptic is overeating, is the control of appetite. You've heard of GERD, you've heard of gastric bypass, all of these things. None of these things would be even heard of or necessary if mankind would eat properly in due season for strength and not for drunkenness. You see, when individuals are extremely overweight, sometimes their doctor suggests that they have a gastric bypass, or they staple the stomach, or they band the stomach, gastric banding. But what that really comes down to is that they are putting a physical barrier between themselves and their appetite. But what we need to do is make a decision, purpose in our hearts, not to overeat. Because what will happen if we just put a physical barrier, the person may continue to overeat and may even enlarge that area that they banded off. And so the area that they do have that's functional, they may actually enlarge and be able to eat just as much as before. And not to mention the many side effects, many of them deadly, from these kind of procedures. You see, the foundation truly for proper digestion is the mind. It's our purpose. It's what's in our heart. It's what we decide to do. It says in Proverbs 13:25 that the righteous eateth to the satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want. You see, this is a biblical principle. If we are walking according to the word of the Lord, if we truly want to purpose in our hearts to follow God, we will eat to the satisfying of our minds. We won't be controlled by our belly. Our belly will not dictate what we eat. Our appetite will not dictate what we eat. But our mind will be in control. Logic is the key here. Have I had enough to eat? Don't ask your belly or your taste buds. Ask your mind. Consult with the biblical principles that you have laid up as treasure in your mind. I'll submit to you, most people in the United States today and in the Western world are not following this admonition. They're not following this advice. I'm going to take you to a series of slides here that will help to further elaborate this point. You see, the Centers for Disease Control have been keeping an eye on the general population's health trends, and one of these areas they've been monitoring is obesity and overweight. In the next few slides that I'm going to go through, we're going to look at the transition from 1985 to 2010. And as we see an increase in the color, the intensity of the color, and we see a change over to other colors, I want you to keep an eye on the key found at the bottom of the slide. And you can actually see how this is increasing dramatically over these just a few decades. Before we do that, though, I have a verse from the book of Proverbs. It says in Proverbs 14:35, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Economic crisis, morality crisis, or anxiety crisis. You know, all of these things are found in society today. Righteousness has truly not been exalting our nation. But these few slides are going to highlight an underlying cause that has had a major role in bringing this nation overall to a crisis state. 1985, 86, we saw a slight change. 87, and we see an increase in the amount of obesity. Dramatic increase. Up to 20% in some states now over 25%. 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. It's not getting any better. In fact, given these current trends, by the year 2025, 50% of the U.S. population will be obese. That's 1 out of every 2 persons. And that's not just being overweight. That is being obese. A tremendous detriment to your health as well. It's interesting to note that many of those individuals that are obese have brains that are similar to those of the alcoholic and the cocaine dependent. You see, they found that in terms of addictive response, many of the obese individuals in the world today are being controlled by their addictions, and that's what's prompting them to eat more. We learn that righteousness exalteth a nation, but a nation that is coming down with physical debility is not a nation that is truly glorifying God in their bodies. We also learn that we need to consult logic and reason as opposed to consulting appetite and our taste buds and how we feel. But these individuals, according to this brain mapping, are relying on impulses and feelings when they're planning out their meal plans. What does that do to us as Christians? What does having an addiction do to us as a Christian? Well, it's very sad. You see, normally we have things that we enjoy in life, that we truly enjoy. And there may be some things that you don't really enjoy. That's okay too. Such as in this model, we have cleaning toilets. Many people don't enjoy cleaning toilets. But I'll submit to you that these are healthy behaviors. Hobbies, Bible study, prayer, eating healthfully, exercise. These are all good things, and we should enjoy doing them. But when we have an addiction, either substance or behavior, every single other pleasure, everything that we used to enjoy doing is downgraded, except the addictive substance or the addictive behavior. These things are held to such great esteem by the chemical physiology in the brain. And this is not even by choice this is happening. This is a result of our choices. But the brain is basically taking on another spirit. All of these other things that used to be beneficial, that you maybe used to enjoy, are downgraded. And all of a sudden, the Scripture becomes a reality. In Philippians 3:19, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. From the book Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 12, we have this admonition. It says, Christ has here left us a most important lesson. He would lay before us the danger of making our eating and drinking paramount. He presents the result of unrestrained indulgence of appetite. The moral powers are enfeebled so that sin does not appear sinful. Crime is lightly regarded, and passion controls the mind, until good principles and impulses are rooted out, and God is blasphemed. All this is the result of eating and drinking to excess. This is the very condition of things which Christ declares will exist at His second coming. And this is the very condition of things that we see in this world today. Are you getting ready? Are you purposing in your heart to follow the Lord? Not just in spiritual matters, but in even eating and drinking, in dietetic reform. Keep in mind, we can't do it alone, but we can do this through God's strength, through looking at the author and finisher of our faith. Because in Revelation 3:21, He gave us this counsel, even as I also overcame. You see, Christ fasted for 40 days and 40 nights on our behalf. He did it for us, and He was most severely tempted after this. But this was His method of success. He said, man doth not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord. How do you live today? Is it by bread alone? Is it by impulse or appetite? Brother or sister, I would encourage you, as Daniel did in days long ago, purpose in your heart to choose to serve God, not just in your mind, but in your bodies, which are His.